Greetings, dear listeners. Welcome to Ghastly Tales. Tonight's story is episode number 6 in our The Ghost Story Society series, a loving celebration of the ghost stories I feel are among the best ever written. There's also a wraparound story before each reading. We've done a recap of sorts for episode 6 for our new listeners, but please do listen to the previous 5 episodes as well to fully enjoy this series. Enjoy the show, and I'll be back at the end of tonight's tale with some important announcements. Miss them at your peril. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the Ghost Story Society. It has been some time since we last met. Usually I would say that was a good thing, for I hoped that the malevolence here at Usher House had entered into a deep and welcome slumber. Alas, if only that were true. It seems that the evil in this very room was only waiting in the shadows. As you know, we, the 13 members of the Ghost Story Society, meet whenever the candle in this room is extinguished by an unseen hand. We do so to tell a macabre tale, as the 100-year-old tradition tells, that this keeps the darkness sated, at least for a while. Some of our members scoff at the idea, believing that the flame falters naturally, that such things happen in a draughty old house such as this. Indeed, I too once felt that way, that the Ghost Story Society was a quaint gathering of enthusiasts for the genre, and that the history to this place, the fire which killed so many in this room, and fuels their supposed ghostly desire to break through into the world of the living, was just another ghost story, a harmless tale to give our meetings purpose. I know now that this is not the case. Before the candle burns out, the staff here at Usher House enter this room. Many do it against their will, but they believe, you see. They have lived here, worked, seen and heard and felt the presence which creeps through the wooden beams above us, the oak panelling on the walls and around the fireplace of all places. The staff enter here and replace the candle before it goes out. Then they open the door regularly to check that the flame is still burning, not daring to re-enter the room without good reason. The candle has been replaced these last few months, each and every day. The flame has remained lit, passed on from one candle to the next. I found it strange that we had not been asked to come here for such a long period, and so, just a few hours ago, I decided to visit Usher House to ensure that my fears were unfounded. You see, a growing dread has been creeping through my mind these last few months. Dreams, horrid nightmares which I will not speak of here. And upon waking each time, my mind's eye has been drawn to Usher House, to a feeling that all is not well. So much so that I had to finally come here to see for myself. When I arrived, the staff were surprised to see me, But I was not surprised to see the effects of several quiet months at Usher House upon their faces. Each of them had a withdrawn look, a darkness beneath their eyes, and when I asked if they too had been kept awake by horrid dreams, they could only nod, though not wishing to discuss their content, for fear that what resides inside this room could have been listening. I asked to see the room itself, and so I was led up the stairs. When I stepped onto this floor, my footfalls felt unsure somehow. An insidious fear took hold that the very ground beneath me might fall away, revealing a spiral abyss from which I would never escape. I began to hurry to the room, hoping that everything would be as it should, and then leave the house quickly to the comfort of my own home. But that was not to be. I reached the door, and with a deep breath, I turned the handle. It felt cool to the touch, and for a moment as I pushed against the door, it felt as though something was on the other side, not stopping my entry, but instead pulling the door inward. It opened all too easily and quickly. I breathed a sigh of relief as I peered into the room. The candle was still lit on the mantelpiece, its flicker illuminating the portrait of our founder above it. For a moment I listened. Deathly silence, and nothing more. Slowly I pulled the door shut, turning to the two staff members who had accompanied me. I smiled nervously at them, happy that nothing untoward had happened. It was then that I heard a noise, a sliding sound on the floor at my feet. Looking down instinctively, I gasped in horror. Someone inside the room had slid a paper note beneath the door. It was too much for one of the staff members, who begged that we not read it. We should burn it and walk away. "The candle is still lit," they whimpered. "Leave it be." But I could not. If some unseen thing inside that room wished to communicate with me, I had to know what its message was. Perhaps it would explain the horrid dreams I'd been having. Bending over, I retrieved the note and, in shaking hand, opened the piece of paper. The paper itself was yellowed, as if it had been exposed to a musty air for some time. But it was the message which sent a shiver through my soul. It read, "She's ours now." Then I heard what I can only describe as a rasping laugh from the other side of the door, distant, echoing, and sounding in part as though it came from somewhere much farther away. The door clicked and the handle turned. I stepped back in horror, waiting for something to rush at me through the open doorway, but all I saw was the room as it had been before. The candle was lit, and then, with no draught apparent, it simply went out. I know many of you will find this story difficult to believe, as I would not have believed it myself had it not happened to me. Oh, what's that? Oh, the note. Yes, I'm coming to that. It is with great sadness that I must report the death of one of our members. If you look around, you will see that now we do not number 13, but only 12. One seat is vacant. Erin Turner was found in her bed last night, dead of a heart attack, at the age of only 29. Now more than ever, the message on the note bears a malice I had never thought possible. It could all be a coincidence, but I know in my gut that it is not. Something from Usher House snuffed out Erin Turner like the candle on the mantelpiece, which brings us here. Knowing all this, I must ask each of you, does anyone wish to leave the Ghost Story Society for good? I am glad that we are all in this together. We have then a decision to make. Do we find a 13th member, or do we continue on as 12? Those in favour of bringing in a new member, raise your hands. Those opposed? I see. That's it settled then. We remain 12 in number from here on. This has never happened before in the history of the Ghost Story Society, but I too believe it would be dangerous to bring in new members, exposing them to something potentially fatal. My conscience would not rest well with that, and I suspect neither would any of yours. We 12 must now carry the burden together. I just hope that it is enough to keep the evil here at bay. For now, we must continue our tradition. The candle went out, and so we must read a ghost story in the hope that it will satisfy those watching from the shadows. I feel it is fitting at this time of despair that we turn to the words of our founder, M.R. James. He knew a thing or two about the terrifying forces which we face, and legend has it he faced similar dangers himself many times. We can only hope to have his fortitude. And so we will now dim the lights as I read to you by candlelight M.R. James's Rats. This story begins with a quote. And if you was to walk through the bedrooms now, you'd see the ragged, mouldy bedclothes a-heaving and a-heaving like seas. And a-heaving with what? He says. Why, with the rats under 'em. But was it with the rats? I ask because in another case it was not. I cannot put a date to the story, but I was young when I heard it, and the teller was old. It is an ill-proportioned tale, but that is my fault, not his. It happened in Suffolk, near the coast, in a place where the road makes a sudden dip, and then a sudden rise. As you go northward, at the top of that rise stands a house on the left of the road. It is a tall red brick house, narrow for its height. Perhaps it was built about 1770. The top of the front has a low triangular pediment with a round window in the centre. Behind it are stables and offices, and such garden as it has is behind them. Scraggy Scotch firs are near it. An expanse of gorse-covered land stretches away from it. It commands a view of the distant sea from the upper windows of the front. A sign on a post stands before the door, or did so stand, for though it was an inn of repute once, I believe it is so no longer. To this inn came my acquaintance, Mr. Thompson, when he was a young man, on a fine spring day, coming from the University of Cambridge, and desirous of solitude and tolerable quarters and time for reading. These he found, for the landlord and his wife had been in service and could make a visitor comfortable, and there was no one else staying in the inn. He had a large room on the first floor commanding the road and the view, and if it faced east, why, that could not be helped. The house was well built and warm. He spent very tranquil and uneventful days, work all the morning, an afternoon perambulation of the country round, a little conversation with country company or the people of the inn in the evening over the then fashionable drink of brandy and water, a little more reading and writing, and bed. And he would have been content that this should continue for the full month he had at disposal. So well was his work progressing, and so fine was the April of that year, which I have reason to believe was that which Orlando Whistlecraft chronicles in his weather record as the charming year. One of his walks took him along the northern road, which stands high and traverses a wide common called a heath. On the bright afternoon when he first chose this direction, his eye caught a white object some hundreds of yards to the left of the road, and he felt it necessary to make sure what this might be. It was not long before he was standing by it, and found himself looking at a square block of white stone fashioned somewhat like the base of a pillar, with a square hole in the upper surface. Just such another you may see at this day on Thetford Heath. After taking stock of it, he contemplated for a few minutes the view, which offered a church tower or two, some red roofs of cottages and windows winking in the sun, and the expanse of sea, also with an occasional wink and gleam upon it, and so pursued his way. In the desultory evening talk in the bar, he asked why the white stone was there on the common. "A old-fashioned thing, that is," said the landlord, Mr. Betts. "We was none of us alive when that was put there." "That's right," said another. "It stands pretty high," said Mr. Thompson. "I dare say a sea mark was on it some time back." "Ah, yes," Mr. Betts agreed. "I have heard they could see it from the boat. But whatever there was, it's fell to bits this long time." "Good job too," said a third. "'Twarn't a lucky mark, by what the old men used to say. Not lucky for the fishing, I mean to say." "Why ever not?" said Thompson. "Well, I never see it myself," was the answer. "But they had some funny ideas. What I mean, peculiar, them old chaps, and I shouldn't wonder but what they made away with it theirselves." It was impossible to get anything clearer than this. The company, never very voluble, fell silent, and when next someone spoke it was of village affairs and crops. Mr. Betts was the speaker. Not every day did Thompson consult his heath by taking a country walk. One very fine afternoon found him busily writing at 3 o'clock. Then he stretched himself and rose, and walked out of his room into the passage. Facing him was another room, then the stairhead, then 2 more rooms, one looking out to the back, the other to the south. At the south end of the passage was a window, to which he went, considering with himself that it was rather a shame to waste such a fine afternoon. However, work was paramount just at the moment. He thought he would just take 5 minutes off and go back to it. And those 5 minutes he would employ, the Bettses could not possibly object, to looking at the other rooms in the passage, which he had never seen. Nobody at all, it seemed, was indoors. Probably, as it was market day, they were all gone to the town, except perhaps a maid in the bar. Very still the house was, and the sun shone really hot. Early flies buzzed in the window panes. So he explored. The room facing his own was undistinguished, except for an old print of Bury St. Edmunds. The 2 next him on his side of the passage were gay and clean, with 1 window apiece, whereas his had 2. Remained the south-west room, opposite to the last, which he had entered. This was locked, but Thompson was in a mood of quite indefensible curiosity, And feeling confident that there could be no damaging secrets in a place so easily got at, he proceeded to fetch the key of his own room, and when that did not answer, to collect the keys of the other 3. One of them fitted, and he opened the door. The room had 2 windows looking south and west, so it was as bright and the sun as hot upon it as could be. Here there was no carpet, but bare boards, no pictures, no washing stand, only a bed in the farther corner, an iron bed with mattress and bolster, covered with a bluish check counterpane. As featureless a room as you can well imagine, and yet there was something that made Thompson close the door very quickly and yet quietly behind him, and lean against the window-sill in the passage, actually quivering all over. It was this, that under the counterpane someone lay, and not only lay, but stirred. That it was someone and not something was certain, because the shape of a head was unmistakable on the bolster, and yet it was all covered, and no one lies with a covered head but a dead person. And this was not dead, not truly dead, for it heaved and shivered. If he had seen these things in the dusk or by the light of a flickering candle, Thompson could have comforted himself and talked of fancy. On this bright day, that was impossible. What was to be done? First, lock the door at all costs. Very gingerly he approached it, and bending down, listened, holding his breath. Perhaps there might be a sound of heavy breathing and a prosaic explanation. There was absolute silence. But as, with a rather tremulous hand, he put the key into its hole and turned it, it rattled, and on the instant a stumbling, padding tread was heard coming towards the door. Thompson fled like a rabbit to his room and locked himself in. Futile enough, he knew it was. Would doors and locks be any obstacle to what he suspected? But it was all he could think of at the moment, and in fact nothing happened. Only there was a time of acute suspense, followed by a misery of doubt as to what to do. The impulse, of course, was to slip away as soon as possible from a house which contained such an inmate. But only the day before he had said he should be staying for at least a week more, and how if he changed his plans could he avoid the suspicion of having pried into places where he certainly had no business? Moreover, either the Bettses knew all about the inmate and yet did not leave the house, or knew nothing, which equally meant that there was nothing to be afraid of, or knew just enough to make them shut up the room, but not enough to weigh on their spirits. In any of these cases it seemed that not much was to be feared, and certainly so far he had had no sort of ugly experience. On the whole, the line of least resistance was to stay. Well, he stayed out his week. Nothing took him past that door, and often as he would pause in a quiet hour of day or night in the passage and listen, no sound whatever issued from that direction. You might have thought that Thompson would have made some attempt at ferreting out stories connected with the inn, hardly perhaps from Betts, but from the parson of the parish or old people in the village. But no, the reticence which commonly falls on people who have had strange experiences and believe in them was upon him. Nevertheless, as the end of his stay drew near, his yearning after some kind of explanation grew more and more acute. On his solitary walks he persisted in planning out some way the least obtrusive, of getting another daylight glimpse into that room, and eventually arrived at this scheme. He would leave by an afternoon train about 4 o'clock. When his fly was waiting and his luggage on it, he would make one last expedition upstairs to look around his own room and see if anything was left unpacked. And then, with that key, which he had contrived to oil, as if that made any difference, the door should once more be opened for a moment and shut. So it worked out. The bill was paid, the consequent small talk gone through while the fly was loaded. Pleasant part of the country, been very comfortable thanks to you and Mrs. Betts. Hope to come back sometime. On one side. On the other, very glad you found satisfaction, sir. Done our best, always glad to have your good word. Very much favoured we've been with the weather, to be sure. Then I'll just take a look upstairs in case I've left a book or something out. No, don't trouble, I'll be back in a minute. And as noiselessly as possible he stole to the door and opened it. The shattering of the illusion. He almost laughed aloud. Propped, or you might say sitting, on the edge of the bed was nothing in the round world but a scarecrow. A scarecrow out of the garden, of course, dumped into the deserted room. Yes. But here amusement ceased. Have scarecrows bare bony feet? Do their heads loll onto their shoulders? Have they iron collars and links of chain about their necks? Can they get up and move, if never so stiffly, across a floor with wagging head and arms close at their sides, and shiver? The slam of the door, the dash to the stairhead, the leap downstairs were followed by a faint. Awaking, Thompson saw Betts standing over him with the brandy bottle and a very reproachful face. You shouldn't ha' done so, sir. Really you shouldn't. It ain't a kind way to act by persons as done the best they could for you. Thompson heard words of this kind, but what he said in reply he did not know. Mr. Betts, and perhaps even more Mrs. Betts, found it hard to accept his apologies and his assurances that he would say no word that could damage the good name of the house. However, they were accepted. Since the train could not now be caught, it was arranged that Thompson should be driven to the town to sleep there. Before he went, the Bettses told him what little they knew. They says he was a landlord here, a long time back, and was in with the highwaymen that had their beat about the heath. That's how he come by his end. Hung in chains, they say, up where you see that stone what the gallows stood in. Yes, the fishermen made away with that, I believe, because they see it out at sea and it kept the fish off, according to their idea. Yes, we had the account from the people that had the house before we come. You keep that room shut up, they says, but don't move the bed out, and you'll find there won't be no trouble. And no more there has been, not once he haven't come out into the house, though what he may do now, there ain't no saying. Anyway, you're the first I know on that's seen him since we've been here. I never set eyes on him myself, nor don't want. And ever since we've made the servants' rooms in the stabling, we ain't had no difficulty that way. And only I do hope, sir, as you'll keep a closed tongue, considering how an house do get talked about. With more to this effect. The promise of silence was kept for many years. The occasion of my hearing the story at last was this, that when Mr. Thompson came to stay with my father, it fell to me to show him to his room, and instead of letting me open the door for him, he stepped forward and threw it open himself, and then for some moments stood in the doorway, holding up his candle and looking narrowly into the interior. Then he seemed to recollect himself and said, "I beg your pardon. Very absurd, but I can't help doing that for a particular reason." What that reason was, I heard some days afterwards, and you have heard now. You may now turn on the light. M.R. James wrote Rats towards the end of his career. It is an often overlooked story, but one I feel has the power to cause dread in the listener. Let us hope then that those listening from the dark corners of this room can feast on that dread, and that we shall all be safe once more. I suggest for now we do not hold our usual supper downstairs. The less time we spend in Usher House, the better. Now, let's see what tomorrow brings. Ladies and gentlemen, we must now leave, but let us do so quietly. We hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of our ongoing anthology series, The Ghost Story Society. It will be interesting to see what happens to the members of the Ghost Story Society in the remaining episodes. If you haven't listened to any of the earlier episodes, you'll find them both on our podcast at theghastlytalespodcast.com and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/ghastlytales. And please remember that all of our other existing shows will be returning soon for your listening pleasure. If you'd like to support the show, please do consider contributing anything you can to patreon.com/Michael Whitehouse. Every penny goes back into producing more original horror content for you to enjoy, and you get some creepy exclusives as well for signing up. You may have noticed that things have been quiet for a while, but this has mainly been down to myself becoming a dad for the first time and taking some time out to adjust accordingly. But now I'm back, as are the rest of the Ghastly Tales team, and we can't wait for you to see what we've got in store for you all. It won't hurt much. Looks like the storm is subsiding. Time for you to be on your way once again. But should you return home to hear a stumbling sound from the room next to yours, best leave it alone, for what lives in there does not suffer visitors gladly. Good night, dear listeners, unpleasant dreams, and I'll see you soon for another Ghastly Tale.